What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Silent Hill F. A bit of an unscheduled stop on my review schedule as I had to fill a gap, but it was an interesting enough experience that I thought it was worthwhile, and so here we are. But to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a video linked down below that covers everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. And to that end, a couple of things to note here. While this is coming out about a week or so after the game officially released, I did receive a review key for it from Konami, but I did not receive that review key until the day the game launched, and so here we are. But that probably worked out because I was able to make use of an incredibly thorough guide over on Steam that I'll actually link down below if you're curious. That can help you, do things like see all the endings or some of the more highly missable collectibles. Because 100% on this game involves several different runs through it to see its New Game Plus cycles. I would say with saves coming you can do it in 3, but more likely is roughly 4 and then like a half run for one of the more silly endings. But the thing about those New Game Plus cycles is that some of them come with collectibles that can only be collected on that New Game Plus cycle. So if you're aiming to do this for yourself, I would highly recommend checking something out ahead of time. But with all of that in mind, let's go ahead and actually dive into this. You see, Silent Hill F is meant to be a psychological horror game, of course, as is the rest of the Silent Hill franchise, but in the case of this particular entry, it also blends together some combat elements that I would say towards the later half of the games, with a bunch of forced combat sections and some bosses that are just straight up Souls-like bosses. It's really more of a mixed genre in some cases. And while ultimately I really don't think the combat was much to write home about, because I don't think it serves the type of game they were trying to make here very well, which we'll get into more in depth of course, I also had some issues with technical problems and the like, and so sum total I would say this is a buy on sale for me. Though I do think the story was good enough to keep it from being completely meritless. Now that said, let's dive into the rest of this over the course of this review. So, kicking it off first with the technical side of things. So how was Silent Hill F running? And in short, for me, poorly. It wasn't unplayable, but it crashed a lot. I spent ultimately a little over 30 hours with this game, and it crashed probably 15 or so times. Like every 2 to 3 hours, give or take, it was gonna crash. And then on top of that, there were certain areas where you would just get huge FPS dips, freezes, that kind of thing. If you want to see my system specs, they are in the About section of the channel, mind you. While I don't know exactly how widespread these issues were, I don't see a ton of people making reviews about it, that kind of thing, over on Steam as an example. But nonetheless, for me, it ran pretty bad, even if it wasn't outright unplayable. Next up, let's talk difficulty and New Game Plus. So, this game features a variety of difficulty, both for the combat as well as the puzzles. Story through Lost in the Fog. Now, initially, only story and hard mode are available for the action combat, and then once you've beaten the game at least once, you'll unlock the final version, Lost in the Fog. I would imagine this is because a lot of that does in fact seem to be balanced around the idea of you having your upgrades and some extra Omamori equipped, that kind of thing. The puzzle difficulty was actually a little more interesting to me specifically, but before we move on from the combat side of things, the differences in combat are both enemy damage primarily, but also enemy placement. When you have it on higher difficulties, there are more enemies and they can do more damage to you, so you have to be a little more aware of them. So a little twofold side of things. For most of the game, this actually isn't that bad because, in fact, you can avoid a significant chunk of combat. Where you're going to feel this the most is in the last few in-game sections where combat is forced and you have to participate in it to the maximum degree. That said, talking a bit about the puzzle difficulty, I thought this was interesting because, as you would probably expect, it makes significant changes to the puzzles, but not universally. So it kind of takes this on a puzzle-by-puzzle approach. Some puzzles, despite the difficulty you have on, are still basically the same puzzle. They just maybe give you a little less information. Or maybe they change like the ultimate code you're going to find in a note, that kind of thing. Whereas some changes to puzzles are like complete overhauls. They play entirely differently, like you need different items, you need to go to different places, that kind of thing. Even if the core end goal of it is still the same, which I thought was an interesting touch. So nonetheless, depending on your want for difficulty here, the game can either be somewhat easy or relatively difficult once you get to those later parts, but in getting to those later parts, you're almost certainly going to involve yourself in New Game Plus. This game has multiple New Game Plus cycles based on your current progression. That's important because the game itself has a singular ending to the main story at first. Your first run will always end the same way, but once you get to the subsequent New Game Plus cycles, you can start unlocking different things. Rooms that were previously closed will now be available to you. Items that weren't there will now be available, allowing you to complete these little extra side puzzles in order to unlock some of the prerequisites to getting and working your way towards the true ending, which requires at least a minimum third run. Now, I don't personally necessarily mind this, but given that in order to get like the full actual story of the game, you're going to have to run through it at least 3 times. I think that's probably going to wind up being a little bit off-putting to at least some people, though the game itself is not terribly long. A first run, you're probably looking at like 10 to 12 hours, with subsequent runs being much shorter as you focus on the new stuff. In fact, I think my quickest one out of the 4 total was a little over 3 hours, and that was more or less just beelining it to where I needed to be. Speaking of those New Game Plus cycles, though, let's go ahead and talk about story setup and my thoughts on it. Now, I am going to do my best to avoid spoilers here, but there may be some contextual stuff in the footage, and what we consider a spoiler may vary, so with that in mind, you've been warned. Now, I will say, I do think the story is probably the best thing about this game on an individual level. I really liked the story. It starts off relatively confusing, and then with subsequent New Game Plus cycles, it peels back more and more of the layers of what happened here, to where once you get to the end of it, you're like, oh, I have a pretty clear picture of what happened, what this was all about, and how our protagonist will be moving forward, that kind of thing. But ultimately, Silent Hill F is a Silent Hill game, and so our protagonist, a young woman named Hinako, is traveling to the general store of her hometown after a fight with her parents, where it is heavily implied she is dealing with some level of domestic abuse. But upon arriving to the general store, things go from rough to worse when a fog rolls in and brings a whole host of disgusting monsters with it that immediately kill one of her friends, and you barely escape from, which then sets us on the path of the rest of the journey to try to escape these things and, of course, figure out why they're here to begin with. This takes some interesting turns as we go, and that's really about as much as I want to say in terms of the plot setup. But broad strokes, I think this particular game tells a really good story about family and values in 1960s Japan that is ultimately really only going to unfurl itself completely if you actually see it all the way through to the end. I think the true ending in particular actually does a really good job of actually recharacterizing a lot of what you had learned up to that point through the other subsequent endings that ultimately made it worth the time investment. I think that payoff specifically is probably my favorite thing about this experience in total. But unfortunately, having to drag myself through a lot of the rest of this experience made it difficult to reach that ending just from a perseverance standpoint. I was pretty over it by that point, thanks to things like the technical issues I mentioned and the stuff with combat we're going to get into. But first, let's talk about progression itself. So there is a bit of progression to this game, a fair bit of it depending on how you want to look at it, but basically, as we explore and maneuver our way through the game, we're going to be picking up things that can be given as offerings to the various shrines that we will save our game at, and this gives us the currency of faith. We can use faith for a few different things, like drawing omamori, items that we can equip to ourselves to provide a whole host of different benefits and everything, and while you can initially only equip one, once you start picking up these wooden plaques, which in combination with faith can be given to the shrines to increase your health, stamina, sanity, or finally, the amount of these items you can equip, you can start feeling a lot stronger, being able to just obviously survive and do more. And that is the bulk of the progression in and of itself, just increasing those stats. However, there are a couple of other things as well associated specifically with the New Game Plus cycles. For starters, towards the end of the initial playthrough, you'll get an item that will then open doors and stuff that you could not previously open in the initial playthrough. This does things like give you extra information, of course, but also allows you access to other things. There are also certain weapons you can get, for instance, just to share one of these, and again, minor spoiler here, one of the endings is a bit of a joke ending about an alien invasion. and if you actually do that on one of your subsequent runs, you can pick up like a little katana lightsaber toy type thing that you can then use as a weapon in the game, and in subsequent New Game Plus cycles, it actually gets bigger and does more damage. So there's progression in that sense as well, and the nice thing about that, including with what I just mentioned there, is oftentimes after you've unlocked these things the first time, they become more readily available on subsequent runs. So for instance, there's a sacred sword you have to unlock as part of the New Game Plus cycles, and once you've done that, it appears at a set place every single run after that, which of course saves you a lot of time. Moreover, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't mention, and you may have seen on screen up to this point, the big fox arm. So there comes a point in the story that is unsettling, to say the least, but your character gets a fox arm that acts as a weapon then and can be used to engage in combat with enemies, and is generally more effective than the weapons you've been swinging around up to that point. So there's a bit of progression in that, but the fox arm and a couple other abilities you get alongside it are only really used in a specific set of story sections that I'll talk a little bit more about here in just a moment, but do be aware there is some stuff around that. Which brings us to the gameplay and world section. So Silent Hill F has an interesting bit of gameplay, and the world itself is really great. So for starters, the atmosphere is fantastic. I love the depiction of this village. The monsters themselves, when they are initially brought to you, are actually pretty intimidating, though that certainly fades over the course of the runs, but I did really enjoy the entire thing. I think the section in the school was probably my favorite, as tends to be the case with this sort of Japanese horror. Something about putting it in a middle school just really seems to make it exceptionally creepy, but nonetheless, the game itself is mostly linear in the sense that you kind of go from one section to one section to one section, but some of those areas are a little bit explorable, and this is where you're going to run around and find side content, little secrets here and there, but you're also going to be picking up a host of different items and resources to help you as you move through the game. This can include things like the offerings for progression that I've already mentioned, but also things like weapons, which you're going to have to keep an eye on top of all sorts of healing items. And doing that exploration and scrounging and trying your best to survive the enemies against the backdrop of then the puzzles and stuff you're going to be running across is really where things get interesting. So it's probably worth mention, however, that the exploration or the sections of the game can be divided up into two things, like the real world and then like these dark shrine levels. These are different in how they are presented to the player, that is. You have different weapon layouts, that kind of thing. So to put it simply, there's the real world where you're actually swinging weapons and have to watch for durability, things like that. And then the dark shrine stuff tends to be where things are a little more fantastical. And obviously that gets more convoluted as you move through the game, but there is a distinction there, which I think is important to mention. Now, there is a focus on survival in the early game in particular, in the sense that you have resources, like all these different things that can heal you that you have to keep track of, and you have limited inventory space. That's one of the upgrades you can get as well to allow you to carry more stuff, but it's always fairly limited, and you have to decide what's worth carrying and what's not. And then of course the offerings you need to bring back to the shrine take up inventory space, that kind of thing. But the thing is, for most of the early game, you just don't have to engage in combat 9 out of 10. Most enemies can just be walked around more or less, or, ran around. Some of them are a little faster than you, but by and large, you can just ignore them, which can do things like spare your weapons and stuff, because weapons have to be found, and they do have a durability associated with them. One of the items you can pick up are toolkits, which can restore that durability, but if an item actually gets to 0 durability, it will generally break on you outside of a couple of the special ones. So a good chunk of this is deciding when to engage with enemies, when to spend those resources, etc., until you get to the late game where it kind of starts making that decision for you. And then naturally, all along the way, we are going to be dealing with the game's various puzzles. For the most part, I really enjoyed these. Obviously, it depends a bit on the difficulty you have on. The story difficulty side of things is obviously very straightforward. On hard mode, I would say, is where I felt the most comfortable, because that's where you can still kind of get the gist by just engaging with all the clues and stuff, but they don't make it as obvious. Lost in the Fog can certainly be a lot more cryptic, and in some cases, their clues are just, kind of outright missing, it feels like. So there's certainly some variance there, and I'm sure different people will feel different types of ways about it, but just, be aware of what you're getting into, I suppose. Because next up, we're talking combat, and as part of that, the forced combat sections. So probably the first and most important thing to understand about combat, and that I'm sure someone's probably typed a comment in the comment section about already, is that some of the clunkiness of this is intentional. The protagonist here is a teenage girl. She's not exactly the picture of strength. And so fighting these enemies is meant to initially be this very tense back and forth, and I can appreciate that and I acknowledge it. And for much of the early game, I think that works. It's difficult enough to teach you to avoid combat where necessary and try to avoid some of these enemies, that kind of thing, and it feels very intentional in those sections. Now the problem is, in my opinion, when the combat starts becoming very forced, meaning that you literally cannot proceed until enemies are dead. And much of the late game sections is just moments where you have to repeatedly kill enemies in order to progress, and even before that there are a couple of bosses you have to contend with. Now the early game bosses aren't so bad, and I wouldn't really consider them like a Souls-like boss or anything like that, but towards the end game, basically the final boss for every story ending you're gonna get is like just straight up a Souls-like boss, and this combat does not feel good enough to be contending with long forced combat sections and bosses that require, I would say, a level of control and fluidity that you just don't really have here in order to feel good. And unfortunately, this approach is at odds with the rest of the psychological horror aspect of the game, because to be very clear, they give you the tools to deal with these bosses, and you can do it. I'm not saying they're too hard or impossible or anything like that. It's very doable. They have movesets. You can learn them. It's like any other Souls-like if you've played them. However, I don't think it fits this specific game due to things like resources, how clunky combat feels as a baseline, things like that. And that is only compounded by the fact that there are often very narrow sections of this game where the camera is just atrocious, enemy movements and grab attacks that feel kind of terrible from the player's side of things, and is ultimately why I just didn't really enjoy it at all. Because to me, it feels like they gave you a combat system that was designed to feel cumbersome and clunky in order to fit with everything else going on with the game, only to then turn around and be like, here's an entirely different genre of game combat you now have to deal with at the end, with this same system that still feels pretty bad. And that just didn't land for me. Now, the basics are the basics, though. You do have a stamina bar that you have to contend with. If you get out of stamina, you can't do anything, you can't dodge, which makes you easier to hit. Otherwise, you have light and heavy attacks you can dodge. Hopefully you will stun an enemy to knock them down for a little bit, so you can easily get some attacks in and deal some real damage. A lot of enemies have a grab attack, which often serves as their psychological attack, which affects your sanity. Sanity heavily involves the game's focus system. You can essentially charge up an attack via focus, which allows you to, of course, do extra combat actions. It depends on the weapon a little bit, but generally this is just like a really big attack, but it also makes doing things like countering enemies' attacks easier, or in the case of some weapons, it'll like let you block, as an example, which you can't do normally. But the catch is, when you are hit in this mode, and when you are hit by an enemy's psychological attack, you take damage to your sanity. If you don't have any sanity, you can't use your focus. And what's more, when you get hit by psychological attacks, that attack will actually deal extra damage because it'll go straight to your health bar. So this is something it's a good idea to, of course, learn and master. But on the other side of things, when you are in the Dark Shrines and you have the Fox Arm and everything, when you max out this seal that in the New Game Plus cycles, but not the first time through, will actually kind of somewhat coincide with your sanity in the sense that the things that fill your sanity also fill this seal. But nonetheless, when it's maxed out, you can go into like a super fox mode and then wipe everything out and not take any health damage, which is extremely helpful for getting through some of the later bosses because, as I mentioned, sanity is able to restore it in New Game Plus cycles, which means you can use sanity restoring items to restore the beast mode and just keep cranking it out until the bosses are dead when you actually have access to it. Though that is, of course, not all the time, as some enemies and occasionally bosses have to be fought when you do not have access to the Fox Arm. So, all in all, combat is, I think, the weak part of this game, specifically because it's trying to do too many things. And I imagine what they were trying to do here is that it starts off really slow and clunky, and then, as you get upgrades and all this other stuff, it eventually becomes better and flows better, that kind of thing, so you can take on the more difficult bosses and feel like you made some progress. But ultimately, it kind of just doesn't feel like that to me. Which is why, when it comes to the forced combat sections towards the end of a run, I think, honestly, it just makes for a poor experience to an otherwise interesting game, which is where we're going to leave the combat section to next talk about the Steam Deck side of things. So the Steam Deck for me is, I would say, alright with some adjustments, which I suppose makes sense if you look at the game's playable rating over on Steam, because basically you can have a decent experience on the Steam Deck, but you're almost certainly going to have to tweak some settings to find a sort of sweet spot of exactly what you want. But I would say at best you're hoping for like 30 FPS here, and it might still occasionally dip in certain places as well. But if you are willing to play around with those settings, then you'll probably be okay, as the rest of it seems fine. It of course has controller support, cloud saves, the important stuff for that platform, but whether or not that's an acceptable experience for you is obviously up to you, I suppose. But that does bring us to our positives, negatives, and then we'll wrap this thing up. So on the positive side for me, basically the story and the atmosphere. I enjoyed the story. I think it was a lot of work dealing with the parts of this game that I didn't like to see the full story, but I am glad that I got to experience it, as I do think it's really good if you can actually see it all the way through to the end. But the problem with that being a lot of runs end, and you are left with not all of the information, frankly, and for some people that's going to be their entire experience, and so whether or not they actually play through all of the other endings to then see the real ending as opposed to the half-finished one they may have seen is obviously going to color their experience of what that story is, but I do think it's worth seeing through to the end. On top of that, the atmosphere is fantastic. Can't argue with that. The creepy tone and vibe of this Japanese town that's largely been abandoned. Of course, these monsters everywhere. Loved the atmosphere. I think they did a great job there. Unfortunately, though, a fair few negatives. Though, for me, it can be summed up basically as the combat system as well as various technical issues. Now, for me, the combat is just at odds fundamentally with what this game is trying to do once you get past a certain point in the game. I can see some people enjoying it, but for me it was just such a juxtaposition to everything else the game was trying to do that it wound up feeling silly and kind of killing my immersion in the total experience, which obviously didn't feel great. Then there were the technical issues, which were the same thing. Every couple hours the game would crash or I would get these FPS drops, and obviously that also pulled me out of the experience. And so I'm left with my conclusion, which is that while this game does some great things that I think were really interesting, there's unfortunately a lot of stuff I had to slog through to get to those parts, which is why for $70 US, I'm giving this one a buy on sale for me. This is not a game I would have felt great about paying that price for, especially with all the problems I wound up having out of it. I don't think it's meritless. As mentioned, there are parts that I enjoyed, but just fundamentally, I don't think the core of the experience that they were trying to present here really shines through without having to hack my way through some stuff I just don't want to do. Hence the buy on sale. Now, that said, as you may have well heard me say in the past, these particular types of games, psychological horror, I've played a couple here and there, but I'd be lying if I said it was like my bread and butter or anything. And to that end, you may very well want to, of course, get a second opinion from somebody who plays more of these games and has different metrics and things they place value in. But as I said, personally, not something I would have wanted to spend $70 on, which is where I'm going to leave this particular review. So certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, let me know how you feel about it down in the comment section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.